Good afternoon and welcome again to the Monastery of All Saints of North America, New Ostrog. And I'm again with my colleague and friend Ron Dart. We're going to talk a little bit about the wisdom of the Desert Fathers, and perhaps from a little different perspective. One thing that's often missed in reading the Desert Fathers, of course, there's a great deal of wisdom, but they're also very powerful psychologists and had a very profound understanding of humanity and the way the human organism operates spiritually, mentally, and emotionally. And their contributions are probably not appreciated nearly enough in this area. And my father, Dr. Dart, had written a master's thesis, his first master's thesis, on St. John Cassian, who was, of course, one of the great Desert Fathers who took that kind of desert spirituality to the West and founded a monastery in the West based on the Desert Fathers, and he himself is one of the great Orthodox Christian Church Fathers. So the teachings that came out of the desert really had such a huge influence on the Church. And St. Anthony the Great is one of the best known historical personages in or out of the Church. And he himself also had very profound impact on Christian thought. And he's credited with coining the term psychotherapy, and like he did, the therapy of the spirit, therapy of the soul. And his system, the systems of the Desert Fathers, the way they dealt with human problems and human issues are very valuable and really should be examined a great deal more. And Ron, I want you to invite you to lead us into a discussion more.
Well, perhaps maybe what we should do to begin with is set the desert tradition in a bit of historic context.
Mm-hmm.
When we think of the desert Abbas or Ammas, there was a whole generation of Christians emerged in the 3rd, 4th, 5th, 6th century, which were very concerned that the church to some degree had lost its way. The church had become the official sort of religion of the waning Roman Empire. And there were men and women who felt that in doing so, it had lost its inner soul, even though it was keeping its external form. And there was a quest, in many ways very similar to what's going on today, a quest for a deeper spirituality, a quest for a deeper understanding of experience with God, and the way that people could go to greater depths in their own soul and go through the journey of their physical desires, soul into spirit, and how you integrate all of that. And the sheer demands of the Roman Empire at the time, with all its busyness, is very similar to our time today, where we have a multiplicity of distractions and diversions that can keep us busy from one moment to the next. In many ways, probably the most sophisticated opiate of our culture is busyness. We just keep popping the pills of one activity after another, and it's a form of addiction. And the desert tradition in the 2nd to 6th centuries, they were in many ways struggling with the same issues. Is this running frantically from one thing to the next, and in the process losing your soul. And so the desert was not only a literal turn from the busyness of the city to the stillness of the desert, but a move from a multiplicity of demands in which all things are stripped away. In the desert there are no distractions, there is no busyness. And so who are you now before God? What is your real identity when all these diversions are taken away? And how do you go deeper in your own journey? And it was these underlying questions of the desert mothers and fathers that make them sort of relevant for us today when people are asking questions about identity, about purpose, about how do they live their lives in a more meaningful manner. And this was at the heart of the desert mothers and fathers, why Paul of Thebes headed out to the desert, why Anthony headed out from Egypt further into Nitria and Scetis. And it was really a search for their deeper soul, for their own salvation in that most meaningful sense of the word, of answering the deeper question of how do I live and who am I in that living?
Sure. Yeah, we remember some of the often forgotten heroes like Sarah of Egypt, who used to hear the confession of some of the monks, sort of like Huldah in Britain.
Sure, of course.
And who used to hear the confessions for all the monks at Great Crowland. And Pelagia the repentant, who was in the little kelly with the little window, and some of the monks would come and seek her advice and all. The likeness of that era and our own really strikes me because, I speak at a number of universities every year. And in past years, usually a dozen or more universities in a year. And talking to the younger people, although I'm usually lecturing in philosophy of quantum physics or in the philosophy department, we, because I go in full sail, religion comes up. And you realize that one of the big issues, because I ask a class sometimes, how many of you were raised in a Christian family? For those born before the 90s, it will be something like 95, 99%. And then you ask them, how many of you still consider yourselves to be Christians? It might be 4 or 5%. For those born after 90, usually about 50% of them were raised in a Christian family rather than 90-some%. And sometimes 2 or 3% will consider themselves still Christians. And among the reasons they give for it, in nearly 40 years of lecturing there, no one has ever mentioned evolution or Darwin as a reason why they rejected Christianity. No one has ever mentioned even one time as a reason for rejecting Christianity. Christian hypocrisy, Christian bigotry, the involvement of the church in politics, and the doctrine of atonement is number one. The number one reason why people reject Christianity, the doctrine of atonement. And I've kept a notebook all these years on these things. And Christian hypocrisy and bigotry follow afterwards. The lack of any kind of spiritual depth because it's been swallowed up in politics. The preaching of hate and malice. But really so much of the Christianity of our day is swallowed up in politics and swallowed up in the events and the affairs of the day. Preachers and sometimes priests want to tell people how they should vote, but they can't tell them how they should live. And when they do tell them how they should live, it's some kind of dry legalistic moralism. It isn't anything that penetrates to the spirit. And when the Desert Fathers went off into the desert, they didn't abandon the world, but in many respects they held the world up from collapsing through their prayers and their struggle. And they were very much concerned with humanity. When people would come to see Abba Anthony the Great, and he would penetrate into the soul in a way, and it might seem mystical in a certain respect, but in fact it was awareness, because he paid attention to people. And so many of our clergy even don't actually pay attention to people. People come out of seminary, they think they're a spiritual father. I mean, you have to be a priest for 25, 30 years before you're a spiritual father. Nobody's a spiritual father, but they all like to think themselves as Abbas. And because of the arrogance, they generally don't pay any attention to people. They don't listen, they don't spend time with them, they don't try to see what's going on. But above all, they don't know what's going on inside themselves. They've never taken time to look within themselves and see what's going on. You can only know yourself in relation to other people, but you can only know other people in relation to yourself. And people never seem to find time to look into themselves to see what and who they are. And the more you know about yourself, the less possible it is to judge and condemn other people. And that's one of the missing dimensions in our spiritual life in our day, is that people have become hyper-moralistic. So the whole religion has been lowered down to a moral code. But it hasn't been lowered, but nobody is still really focused on the inner transformation of the transformation of the inner person, yes, the transformation of the heart.
Yeah.
And this is what the Desert Fathers saw, that in the imperial church, the exteriors were there, and people were concerned about the exteriors, but their desires swallowed them up. And it's always the desire that swallows people up. And perhaps one of the great tragedies of our particular era, and why we need to look back to the Desert Fathers and back to the meaning of the prayer for the guarding of the mind, because we have a whole industry that's dedicated to enlarging and creating and increasing desire among people. And we have an economic system that can only survive by excess consumption. And you can't market to contentment, you can only market to desire. So you can't allow people to have contentment. And contentment is a prerequisite for happiness. So you have to constantly build up more and more desire so people will consume more and more. Otherwise the economic system would collapse. So our whole economic system is based on desire and excess. That was last time I lectured at the University of Miami in Florida. Driving down to the university, there was a billboard that said, if you want it, you need it. I thought that's one of the most pitiful expressions I've ever seen. And it's really demonic because, you know, that what happens is trying to sell happiness without contentment. Because contentment is counterintuitive to consumer capitalism. And yet happiness is not available without contentment. So happiness is one more purchase away. But instead of happiness, you give desire, is what you're actually giving. And desire is the source of most human suffering. That there's always a desire that robs you of your peace, that makes you envious, that makes you jealous, that makes you want more, that makes some people even commit crimes in order to get what they think they need because they want it. And the Desert Fathers were faced with something very similar to that, and the mothers, when they went away into the desert to try to find themselves as human beings again.
And I think this is, I think you're spot on in what you're saying, and this is at the heart of ascesis, or discipline. And some people confuse the actual formal disciplines of spirituality, whether prayer, fasting, liturgical year of the church, or Eucharist, or prayer beads, with ascesis really meant the internal discernment, or diakrisis, or cutting between the false and the true self, our new being in Christ, the image and likeness of God restored. We're getting to that place of our deepest freedom and self-knowledge, and all that multiplicity of false desires, false longings, false wants, which distract us from our new being in Christ. And the whole deeper ascesis or discipline is knowing the difference between what St. Paul would call the old Adam, or the old Eve, and the new Adam in Christ, or the new Eve. And the forms that were used were purely means or vehicles by which people could take that journey inward and go deeper and deeper and come to know often the complex motivations within, even religious motivations, which can be distorted and perverted with the highest ideals, and people lose their way. And that's why religion and sometimes spirituality can be the last temptation in which we can lose our soul. And this is where the wisdom of the desert mothers and fathers pointed the way to the deeper meaning of transformation and deification and self-knowledge. And in our age, we have people bloated with knowledge, with information, with statistics, and our universities sell information essentially. And people can have their BAs, their MA, PhDs in terms of knowledge, but when it comes to wisdom, when it comes to insight, when it comes to meaningful self-understanding, there's a level of being anemic and shrunken and thin at that level. And the desert mothers and fathers were as aware of this problem back then as we struggle with it today. And of course you can't sell wisdom. That's an honest journey inward, and this is where you get the spiritual directors of the patristic era, where people had done the hard interior work with women and men beside them, so that, because often when people go off only on their own, it can lead to disasters and tragedies. And this is why it's a communal existence, but also people have to work on these inner issues alone, or if they get positions of authority, they can do great. They've initially done harm to themselves if they haven't done the inner work, but then they end up hurting others in the name of directing or guiding them.
Well, I'd like to offer an observation that people don't have knowledge, they have information. Because we don't live in an age of knowledge, we live in an age of information. But information doesn't equal knowledge. And a lot of people have information, and they've gone through university, but they have no knowledge. I have to remember some years ago with a reception, baptized some Serbian kids in Victoria, and there was a Russian professor there who had, I think, had 3 masters and 2 PhDs. And we were having dinner, and he was a bit in his cups. He put away a little too much wine. He was getting very boastful. And Princess Golitsyn, who was an English woman, married to a Russian prince, she finally turned to him and says, "Oh, my dear fellow, what a pity. All that education and no intelligence to go with it." And that's
so true.
But really, you realize that even the education is lesser because you can get the information so quickly that we're into information, we're not into knowledge. And we're certainly not into wisdom. But one of the things that, some of the greatest harm that I've ever seen done to individuals has been done by Orthodox priests in confession. Some of the greatest disasters and damage to the person's soul has been done in confession by priests who think they're spiritual fathers. And they give advice that they're in no way equipped to give because they've never done any work on themselves or looked at themselves. And this introspection, this looking within yourself, which the Desert Fathers did. Now, one thing that strikes me is how the early Desert Fathers, when they talked about the prayer of the guarding of the mind, the prayer of the guarding of the mind is aimed at our inner human suffering. But passions are suffering, sins are suffering. People shouldn't look at sins as breaches of the law, but as a form of human suffering that needs to be healed. But when you talk about the prayer of the mind, the guarding of the mind, the ancient fathers who really defined this understood the way the mind and the brain work long before we had any idea that the whole hegemonicon was in the brain. And because when a stimulus enters the brain, it's going to go to the diencephalon region first, really to the hypothalamus. And from there touches the amygdala region, then goes through a sequence of stases in the brain where it develops. I mean, it does it so fast you don't notice it. And yet the Holy Fathers very clearly understood this. They named these stases in the brain. But this is exactly what happens. And when they said when a temptation first enters, it's nothing, it's no sin, it's nothing. Because, of course, it's an impetus that goes to the amygdala region, which, in case you have to react before you think, to save your life. And it goes through the stasis in the brain, comes up to the frontal lobe, where you actually determine whether you're going to accept it or reject it completely, or take pleasure in it. And then, of course, reconnects with the R complex of the brain in a way. But the way it was described by the Holy Fathers, it's step by step exactly what actually does happen, in fact. And the fact that they had gained this knowledge by looking inside themselves and could better understand human suffering. So this is the point that when people talk about sin, they obviously have never mastered anything. When they talk about human suffering, then they understand what sin and passions are. They're inner human suffering that need to be healed. And when people talk about punishment, they've already lost it instead of healing. Even when you give a person a prostration in confession, sometimes people need to do something. Because one of the biggest things in confession is helping people forgive themselves so that they come out from under the burden of guilt that can make them psychotic. So when you do a prostration, if you just tell them to do prostrations, it's nothing more than a calisthenic. If you tell them that a prostration is a type of the death and resurrection of Christ, and that when you do a prostration, it's a type of the death and resurrection of Christ, of dying to sin and rising to life, of dying with Christ and rising with Christ, then it has meaning, and then it has purpose, and then it accomplishes something. But when you treat it as a punishment, it's useless. When you treat it as a part of a healing process, then it has meaning, and then it's worth something. But so often when we reduce Christianity down to a moral code, then we start thinking about punishment. We don't think about healing, and we forget about Christ. And we think about the law of Moses instead of the moral imperatives of Jesus Christ. And that's one of our tragedies. And the Desert Fathers, looking, but when you see the advice they gave, was the one monk who came to one Abba and said, well, I fell again. And the Abba said, well, pick yourself up. And the monk kept coming back and saying, well, I fell again. And how often should I pick myself up? And Abba said, until you don't fall anymore. In other words, you're going to fall, but pick yourself up. You can always pick yourself up. God's forgiveness is always there when you repent. Now you have to learn to forgive yourself also. Because God has forgiven you, how can you not forgive yourself when God himself has forgiven you? Who are you to judge another man's servant? But there was also that kind of compassion. And one of the interesting things that the Holy Fathers very clearly understood the difference between psychiatric and demonic. And they make a point between psychiatric and demonic. But both of them were treated with the greatest of compassion and tenderness. They would always say if a psychiatric person would swear a curse or something, they would always say the illness said. And if somebody who was demonic said or did something, they would always say the demon said. But they always understood that the person wasn't actually in control. And they had really discerned those areas in which a person couldn't really be responsible because they weren't in control. But they couldn't have done that if they didn't have compassion for other people. They were interested in human beings and the way the human person actually functioned. And they discovered it within themselves in their own struggle. One of our problems is our priests in general never struggle with themselves. They're so busy judging the members of their parish and condemning some of them that they never struggle with their own inner. And the problem is with our fears, because our fears are the root of all of the evil things that we do. Fear is the mother of anger. Anger is the mother of malice. Malice is the mother of murder. But it always goes in that sequence. And it's our inner fears that cripple us, and our inner fears that make us cripple other people.
And I think, and this is where the desert tradition, what it sought to do was to cut below all of that so we're not the victims of our fears, the victims of our insecurities, the victims of our drivenness, the victims of appearances, to go to that still center, that quiet point. This is what Hezekiah, of course, means in Latin, quies, as the people work out of a still center of their new being.
Yeah.
And from there is the place of attentiveness and awakenedness. And that's where, when a person works out of that inner core, they're attentive to others. I mean, as you said earlier, people can be present with you but absent. They're with you physically, but they're elsewhere mentally or in their imagination. They're not purely attentive. A person who's truly living out of that center has cut through the multiple layers of falseness, their false face, that which they really aren't, and they've gone to that place which they're meant to be and live from, and they're really there both for themselves and then for others in the journey. And out of that, of course, then comes compassion, because anyone who struggled with sort of that agon, the great agonies of transformation, cannot help but be sensitive and compassionate to others, because they know the nature of their own struggles.
That's part of the secret, isn't it? Knowing your own self enough that you can no longer judge and condemn other people for these things, because you know yourself. And you can, if you come face to face with yourself and conquer your own inner fears so that you can actually make some progress. That's the thing. As long as we're haunted by our inner fears, we make no progress. But you also have to help other people be liberated from their fears instead of burdening them with more fears. That's why, in the Divine Liturgy, sometimes people preach, hellfire and brimstone sermons. I think it's blasphemous. The liturgy is the wedding feast of the heavenly bridegroom and the earthly bride. It's not the place for fear and terror. It's a place for rejoicing. It's a place for peace. People should come through the liturgy, experience the joy of the banquet, and leave in a spirit of peace. They should never leave the liturgy in a spirit of agitation. And the priest has no business in the Divine Liturgy stirring people up to fear and terror of hell and the devil and all that, but rather to invite them into the wedding banquet and remind them that the tree of paradise grows in the altar on the holy table, and the chalice is the tree of paradise, and the fruit of the tree of paradise is Jesus Christ, who is, of course, the source of all life. And if it's the tree of life, then Jesus Christ is the fruit of the tree of life.
And one of my favorite stories, I mean, there's many lovely stories and parables told within the desert. I mean, it didn't, as much as some of the desert tradition was interested in theology, its primary concern was the application of theology for life.
As a living.
And lifestyle. And of course, the tendency always in people is to judge others and evaluate others and do the Pharisee thing. Thank God I'm not as them. But one of the stories is told of one of the abbas who was very well respected in the desert, and a couple of novices had committed a couple of faux pas and peccadillos, and the community wanted to gather around to judge him, so they called this elder, sort of pronounce final judgment on him. So he comes bit by bit to the community with a big bag with sand running out of the bag, and when he reaches them, and they said, "And what do you say, Father?" And he says, "Well, just as in this whole journey, the sand falling out of the bag, it's like my many sins constantly falling out. Who am I to judge? Am I to judge this person?" And so it's similar to Jesus's comment with the prostitute. Who are you to judge? And which of you has not sinned? So yeah, there's this sense within the desert tradition that because of their vulnerability and their honesty of their struggle and their self-understanding of what that struggle was about and the pain of it, they understood others in their struggle. They empathized. There was affinity. So it prevented them from judging. It allowed them to say, "Listen, I'm really on the same road with you, and what can I do to sit by your side on this journey? And if you fall, I'm there to hold you up." And it's this searching compassion and kindness that the desert mothers and fathers bring forward in the spiritual journey that can, I think, offer real insight and wisdom and healing for a form of religion which can be bloated on knowledge or bloated on judgmentalism, and the real transformation and healing comes with people who know the struggle and will walk side by side and not judge you on it.
Well, yeah, we can have people who are extremely religious but have no faith. And we have a lot of people, even among the clergy in all religions, who have religion, but they have no faith, no living faith. And it's perhaps one of the tragedies that happens, but it's also one of the things that pushes younger people toward atheism, even while they're searching for spiritual life.
Oh, of course. Yes.
Because the younger generation are not less spiritual than previous generations, they're more spiritual, if anything.
I would agree, they're more deeply spiritual.
More deeply spiritual, and they're looking for that depth. But they don't get it. Instead, they get moralism. And that's perhaps one of our catastrophes.
Yeah, I think that's a danger, is when you have people honestly, like I'm doing a third-year class this semester in Buddhism, just packed out, and underneath this is the longing of students to find something more meaningful to live by, because many of them have been betrayed from one thing after another, and they do believe in spirituality is the well of living water. But religion, for some of them, has become the very thing that has produced the opposite of what it's meant to produce, to give life. And then their cynicism sets in, skepticism sets in, and then they turn to other religions, which in one sense is a healthy turn, in that they're still trying to maintain the quest. The next step, of course, is to say, perhaps you've been given a false bill of goods, and now let's probe, the mother lode of the Christian tradition, and get to the real questions that are part of that journey. Another interesting story of the desert mothers and fathers is this bishop came in a very affluent ship to this island where there was 3 hermits living separately, and he didn't feel they knew how to pray properly, and so he teaches them. He spends all day with them, teaching them the proper way to prayer, getting the formulas right and the formularies right and all of this sort of business. And then once he thinks that they've got it properly, he gets on his ship, and the deacons are with him, and off he sails. And as he sails off, he sees these three people running across the water, trying to catch up to the ship, and he wonders, oh my word, these are obviously saintly people. And they all run up in the ship, and they say, Father, or Bishop, we forgot how to do the prayer properly. How do we do it? And and at that point he realized, who's he to instruct them? These people are running across water like angels, and he's trying to get the form right. Meanwhile, they've got the reality right. And so people can sometimes create, as we've talked about before, confuse ends and means without recognizing that all these religious means, if they become ends, are forms of idolatry. And the key is to get people to the living fire of the faith, really.
Actually, we can turn the divine services into an idolatry as well. And part of the thing is that people are so particular about serving everything exactly correctly. Nobody ever tells anybody what it means. And so the meaning of it is completely missing to the people. We have a saying that the difference between a liturgist and a terrorist is that you can negotiate with a terrorist, but you can't negotiate with a liturgist. But the form becomes the essence. And at that point, we have an idolatry. It doesn't matter what it is, anything like that. To have a living existential faith and to try to convey something that impacts on people's actual lives, that can actually help to transform people's actual lives. And it turns out that moralism goes just the opposite. It cripples people. And that people, we've lost the discernment between morality and moralism. And so the moralism becomes the whole doctrine of the faith. And the transformation of the inner person is totally missing. And that's what people actually desire. I mean, the younger people, when you look to Buddhism, for example, Buddhism has certain things in common with, say, Orthodox monasticism or Orthodox Christian life. We're both concerned with human suffering. We're both concerned with inner human suffering. Buddhism by the way of negation, Orthodoxy by the way of affirmation. But nevertheless, it's the way of the, Orthodoxy affirms life. Anything that's life negating can't be Orthodox. Anything that's life affirming can be, but life negation can't. But the point is, why people turn to Buddhism is because it speaks more openly and directly about inner human suffering and the problem of human suffering. Whereas Western Christianity, including Orthodoxy, has come to the point where all we're doing is talking about morality. We're not talking about human suffering. And we're not talking about how to have a transformation of the heart or to bring the heart into accord with the conscience, which is what the real struggle is all about.
Or they get into a point of just trying to do an end run on human suffering and tragedy, which is in fact the very means by which we often grow deeper. And so you get this whole, one sense, cult of Christian triumphalism, and that God will deliver you from any pain, any suffering if you just do the right prayers, or you... And this, of course, is a total perversion of Christianity, because it's often through these more difficult life experiences or situations that, in fact, we do go a little deeper in life. But a triumphalist or a moralistic mode becomes the very opposite of the meaning of how you go deeper, because it is about suffering, it is about struggle, and then it's about illumination, it's about insight, it's about transformation. So you do have this death or the seed dying, but it's only when our little ego of the seed dies that in fact the grain of our new being emerges. It's only when the little seed of the grape dies in the ground that in fact the vineyard appears in all of its richness, and the fullness of the wine of the new life appears.
Well, that's part of the problem of human suffering in a way. Okay, Buddhism also looks for a way to totally cast off human suffering. Whereas we would have to say that suffering is one of the things that makes us truly human. And recognizing other people's suffering makes us truly human. And it's in our empathy toward other people's suffering, because we've suffered ourselves, and we've grown spiritually because of our suffering. That our suffering has become not a way to crush us, but a way to increase our capacity of humanity. And that's part of the whole problem of human suffering, is what to do with it. I mean, in a certain way, how to heal this inner human suffering, but the suffering of humanity itself and our own personal suffering. Our own personal suffering really to open our hearts and to open our being and to make us really truly human. It's why to see Christ suffering on the cross. His suffering in the Garden of Gethsemane was far greater than his suffering on the cross. His moral suffering over the condition of humanity. But to see the suffering of Christ has an impact on us that opens us to respond to his suffering in a way that helps us open to the whole gospel of Jesus Christ. And the fact that he does this willingly for our sake really could profoundly affect us in a way that opens us up.
Yes, so rather than suffering becoming something we must oppose or resist, if we have but the eyes to see, is the means of us asking how in fact is this suffering the means God is using to transform me at a deeper level in terms of self-understanding and awakening to my new being in Christ, in the life of the church and in the world in which I live. So some people run from the very means by which they can be transformed into their own freedom and new being in Christ. And so their very life is a means of opposing the means that God is using to transform them.
There were fathers who took on suffering.
Sure.
And because they took on suffering and were aware and had wakefulness toward what was going on with their suffering, that opened them to compassion to humanity. And without suffering, we seldom have compassion for the rest of humanity. So, and I think we're out of time for this discussion. We'll likely carry it on a little later. I think we'll perhaps talk more directly about the Philokalia next time and some examples from the Philokalia. Thank you so much for joining us, and I know some of you have written to me before and you're great fans of the train that goes by, because some of you actually mention it almost with affection. That's the Canadian Pacific Main Line, which runs near the monastery. And we wouldn't make a recording without the train because some of you would likely miss it. But thank you for your prayers and for the comments that you send to us. They're always really gratefully received. And send us your suggestions as well for what you'd like to hear us discuss or talk about on our broadcasts. And we ask that you please keep us in your prayers, and God bless you all. Thank you.
Deed is done.